Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Changing Minds, How Aging Affects Language and How Language Affects Aging, by Roger Kreuz and Richard Roberts. Narrated by Jonathan Yen. Siblings are the only relatives, and perhaps the only people you'll ever know, who are with you through the entire arc of your life. Jeffrey Kluger, Salon. Prologue. A common metaphor for thinking about one's life is to conceptualize it as a journey. One of the companions we have on this journey is our native language. We acquire it, seemingly without effort, in infancy and early childhood, and in some sense we acquire it a second time during formal education as we learn to read and to write. During these years of schooling, though we already possess the body, we learn about our language's skeleton and its connective tissue, its grammar and rhetorical styles. Our vocabularies become larger. We discover the great heights to which language can soar in the prose, poetry, and plays of our native tongue. And then what? For most people, that seems to be the end of the story. We may choose to study other languages, but we typically do so in ways that are fundamentally different from how we acquired our native language, and our native tongue itself may seem like a finished product once our schooling ends. Over time, we will learn additional vocabulary and strive to become better writers, but we typically don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Language is simply one of many skills that we might possess, like being able to juggle or to play the piano. But most jugglers don't move on to study Newton's laws of motion, and most pianists don't feel compelled to study compositional counterpoint or the history of piano building. For most, juggling, playing music, or using language is simply a means to an end, and not an end in itself. Contrary to popular belief, the consensus of researchers who study cognitive aging is that language systems remain largely stable across the lifespan. But does this mean that language is unaffected by aging? Language is a complex phenomenon that relies on other cognitive processes, such as perception and memory. Anyone who struggles to recall someone's name is reminded of language's dependence on memory. Furthermore, as we strain to hear our partner in a noisy restaurant or to read the menu, language's dependence on perception becomes clear as well. It may be helpful to introduce an analogy at this point. Imagine that someone has built an elaborate sandcastle on the beach. The castle itself might be impressive, but sandcastles are only as strong as their base. And as the tide begins to roll in, the foundations of the castle are threatened. The lapping waves will hollow out its underpinnings, and after a time, the elaborate towers and arches may perch precariously on an increasingly eroding base. Nevertheless, the castle may still stand, even though part of its sandy foundation has been washed away. So, how does language hold up as the tide of aging wears away at the foundation of perception and memory? Does a changing mind foreshadow the decline of our linguistic abilities? As it turns out, language, like a well-built sandcastle, can display surprising resilience in the face of cognitive disruption. The complete story of language change in adulthood is one of decline, adaptation, resilience, and even enhancement. These seemingly contradictory outcomes are easier to understand if we conceptualize language not as a unitary phenomenon, but as a set of interacting components. Viewed broadly, language consists of 4 major domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Keep in mind that each domain is part of one integrated, multi-component system. The underdevelopment of one domain for any individual does not mean that he or she lacks linguistic ability. For example, throughout the world, many people never learn to read or write, but we wouldn't characterize those individuals as not having language. In fact, on the evolutionary timescale, the entire human species was illiterate until relatively recently. In addition, blind and low vision individuals experience the written word, but do so through other senses like touch and hearing. Likewise, sign languages are as expressive and as rich as any spoken language. Researchers who explore the relation between language and aging do so using a variety of perspectives. In an admittedly simplistic way, we can subdivide the principal approaches into 4 broad perspectives: developmental, physiological, social, and cognitive. Obviously, these ways of studying language are not mutually exclusive, and many topics that we discuss draw on the contributions of all 4. From a developmental perspective, researchers focus on how the 4 domains are acquired and change over time. For example, when we are born, we are predisposed to identify the sounds of our native language and go on to master the rudiments of speaking in our 2nd year. Reading and writing formally begin with preschool and kindergarten, with reading largely mastered by middle school and writing in high school. Of course, few would claim that they ever totally master writing. From a physiological perspective, research on language and the brain suggests that the 4 domains are capable of functioning somewhat independently. This is perhaps most apparent when we consider the effects of brain injury. The disruptions caused by stroke or head injury can be surprisingly selective. A person who suffers a stroke might lose the ability to read, for example, but may have little or no impairment in the ability to speak and understand language, and even the ability to write may be preserved. From a social perspective, researchers take into account the roles of society and culture to study language use. For example, they look at the effects of stereotypes on aging and the social consequences of ageism. These researchers also study the ways in which the demographics of aging are changing societies around the world. From a cognitive perspective, researchers may zero in on specific constituent processes of language, such as word finding. At the other end of the cognitive spectrum, researchers also explore how the domains operate more broadly, such as in writing about trauma. Because we are cognitive scientists, we draw primarily on research from this field. In the early chapters, we focus on how aging affects the 4 domains of language. We begin by discussing some of the methodological issues that confront researchers who study aging across the lifespan. We then consider some of the cognitive processes that underlie language ability. It's interesting to note that the number 1 fear of people in their 60s, 70s, and beyond is the loss of memory. For this reason, we explore memory's role in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. For example, is the word-finding difficulty that many older adults complain about an issue of memory, language, or some combination of both? In the later chapters, we examine the profound impact of language on aging. The development of more nuanced and insightful ways of communicating allows individuals to achieve a heightened self-awareness. It increases our skill in understanding not just our own experiences and motivations, but those of others as well. The maintenance and even improvement of some linguistic abilities serve as a counterweight to offset declines in cognitive processes like perception and memory. Harnessing our linguistic abilities to enhance the quality of our lives seems to have no upper limit. Among other topics, we look at the benefits conferred by reading, reflective reminiscing, and conversation. Bottom line up front, It behooves us all to use language in the service of healthy aging. 1. Setting the stage. One of the most famous journeys in U.S. history was made by the Corps of Discovery under the command of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. But before their expedition to the Pacific Northwest could begin, they had to make a great many preparations. The explorers had to secure supplies to meet every conceivable need, such as food, tents, clothing, and medicine. In addition, Lewis, as the group's leader, had to familiarize himself with a wide range of subjects, such as astronomy, botany, navigation, and surveying. His mastery of these disciplines helped to ensure the expedition's success when facing the unknown. In a similar way, in this first chapter, we review a variety of topics that are important to keep in mind when thinking about language and adult development. These topics, while diverse, are of fundamental importance and will set the stage for discussing the interaction between language and aging in later chapters. Language by design. Psychologists seem to be stage-struck. In fact, stage theories of development have so permeated our culture that it may seem natural to believe that people pass through different stages as a normal part of getting older. But whether or not such an assessment is accurate has a great deal to do with how we study changes across the lifespan. In stage theories, certain identifiable characteristics describe the passage from one stage to another. Consider the work of the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. He was interested in how children's thought processes changed as they grew. For Piaget, children in the first stage of his cognitive theory do not understand that objects exist in the world when the object is out of sight. Here's an example of how the presence or absence of object permanence could be measured. Imagine a young child sitting in front of a circular train set. A train is running on the track, and in one of the cars is a large plastic dinosaur. At one point, the train enters a tunnel. When the train exits the tunnel, the dinosaur has been replaced by a teddy bear. This would surprise those of us who possess a sense of object permanence. If a train enters a tunnel carrying a dinosaur, then we expect it to exit the tunnel with the same dinosaur. Therefore, children who show surprise at this strange turn of events could be said to have achieved object permanence. If we compare a group of younger children to a group of older children within Piaget's first stage, we would expect to find that the younger children are not consistently surprised by the switch from a dinosaur and teddy bear, whereas the older ones are. This kind of comparison is an example of a cross-sectional study. Cross-sectional studies compare people at different ages performing a particular task. When people at different ages show differences in a task, we can reasonably assume that those differences reflect different points of development. Many studies that compare younger and older adults are cross-sectional in design. The methodology of such studies naturally leads to results that emphasize discontinuity and abrupt transitions. In other words, conclusions drawn from cross-sectional designs can offer support for the idea of discrete stages in development. Instead of recruiting groups of different ages, however, one could simply track the performance of the same individuals over time. Such longitudinal studies are more likely to show gradual changes and continuity. However, these types of studies are difficult to conduct. For one thing, they require the ongoing participation of the subjects, who may move away or decide not to continue their involvement. These studies are also expensive and, most significantly, can take years or decades to complete. For all these reasons, researchers use longitudinal studies less commonly than cross-sectional studies. Here's an example of why this matters. If we went to an elementary school and measured the heights of children in kindergarten through grade 5, we would find that children in different grades have different average heights. A graph of these differences might look like a set of steps. But if we measured the heights of children consistently every few months over the 6-year span, we'd see a gradual change in their heights. A graph of these results would look more like a gently upward sloping line. Researchers can make use of a technique that fuses these two approaches. It's called a cross-sequential design. In cross-sequential designs, different people at different ages are measured, as in a cross-sectional study, but the same people are also tracked for a short period, as in a longitudinal study. Studies that use cross-sequential designs are not as common as longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. However, they illustrate the importance of thinking about distinct stages of development as likely resulting from more gradual processes. Comparing apples to oranges. Just as we saw in the last section, researchers can also use cross-sectional studies to compare the abilities of younger and older adults. At first blush, it seems like this should be a straightforward enterprise. Younger and older adults could be recruited and given a battery of tests to complete under controlled laboratory conditions. The performance of the two groups could then be compared to see if any statistically significant, that is, reliable, differences exist in the cognitive abilities of the two groups. And while this procedure does seem straightforward, the reality is more complex. It turns out that younger and older adults differ on a variety of dimensions, not just their age. As a result, determining which factors are responsible for any differences in performance is often difficult. Imagine a cognitive aging study conducted in the United States in the year 2015. Researchers recruited participants who were about age 25, the younger group, and about 75, the older group. The groups thus had a 50-year difference in age. But did they vary systematically in other ways? To begin with, it is likely that they differed in the number of years of formal education they had attained. Participants in the younger group would be more likely to have had at least some higher education under their collective belts, whereas the older group were of college age in the early 1960s, a time when fewer people attended college. In 2015, 65% of adults aged 25 to 34 had attended at least some college, whereas only 50% of adults aged 65 and over had done so. Therefore, if our sample of younger and older adults was typical, then the participants varied by educational attainment as well as by age. The type of education was probably quite different as well. Our younger group would have started elementary school in the mid-1990s, just as the Internet was taking the world by storm. As a result, they are digital natives, for whom the Internet has always been part of their lives. For the older group, the online world didn't exist until they were in their mid-50s. They are digital immigrants who may use the Internet and all that it offers, but the web hasn't always been a pervasive part of their lives. And younger people are simply smarter than older people, at least if we equate intelligence with performance on an IQ test. It's important to realize that intelligence is a relative attribute, since we have no absolute measure of a person's intellect. When we say that someone has average intelligence, we mean that their measured IQ is about 100. Intelligence tests are carefully constructed and standardized so that the median performance ends up at that nice even number. The problem is that people have been getting better on such tests over time. For example, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, WISC or WISC, has been re-standardized 4 times since it was developed in 1949. This has been necessary because average performance kept improving at a rate of about 3 IQ points per decade in the United States. Therefore, revisions of the test have been designed to be a bit more difficult so as to maintain the average score at 100. This phenomenon is called the Flynn effect, after James Flynn, who documented large gains in IQ over a 45-year period in the United States, and then in more than a dozen other countries. Although the Flynn effect seems quite real, researchers have put forth varied explanations for what might be causing it. Younger people tend to have more education than their elders. However, research has also suggested that parental literacy, changes in family structure, and improvement in nutrition and health may all play a role. Researchers also debate whether the Flynn effect is continuing or even reversing. For our purposes, it's enough to note that it represents yet another way that younger and older adults may differ besides chronological age. Older adults also differ from younger adults in that they are, well, older. Although aging does not cause cancer or cardiovascular disease, declines in a person's health can also lead to cognitive decline. But this would not mean that the cause of the decline was age per se. Rather, the cause would be the underlying disease state. Although researchers may want to recruit only older adults without any known cognitive impairment, they cannot always be sure. For example, although most people never develop dementia, the longer one lives, the more likely it is to occur. For people who do develop dementia, the cognitive consequences may show up years before a diagnosis is made. And the procedures that researchers use to screen for dementia may not be sensitive enough to pick up these early declines. As a result, studies that purportedly consist of older participants without cognitive problems may actually contain individuals who are in the early stages of cognitive decline. Let's consider another issue. If you are an older adult who is completing a battery of cognitive tests in a lab, you might well be worried about your performance in a way that simply isn't comparable to younger adults. You are well aware of the negative stereotypes regarding the memory abilities of older adults. You may recall recent occasions when you weren't able to think of a word you were searching for. You might begin to worry that the tests you are taking will objectively document your cognitive decline. These concerns may increase your anxiety and cause you to perform poorly. For younger adults, however, the memory and perceptual tasks might seem more like a video game and arouse no anxiety. This example illustrates a general phenomenon called stereotype threat, which was first documented by the social psychologist Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson. They gave black and white participants a difficult test of verbal ability. One condition emphasized that the test results would reflect one's intellectual ability. In other conditions, the test was described as either not diagnostic of ability or simply a challenging exercise. Steele and Aronson predicted that believing the test measured intellect would activate negative stereotypes for the black, but not the white, subjects. The results were consistent with that hypothesis. Black participants performed worse than white participants in the stereotype threat condition, but about the same as the white participants in the non-threatening conditions. Researchers have observed stereotype threat in older adults as well. When a task was described as requiring memorization, older adults displayed higher levels of stereotype threat than younger participants. Stereotype threat in older adults may be moderated by a variety of factors. Thomas Hess and his colleagues found that participants in their 60s were more affected by stereotype threat than those in their 70s. In addition, stereotype threat was also higher for participants who had more education. Presumably, adults in their 60s are just beginning to confront memory decline, and because educational attainment depends on memorization, any perceived decline would be more concerning. Education, intelligence, and stereotype threat are just 3 of the ways, besides chronological age, that younger and older people differ. We should keep such confounding factors in mind when interpreting the results of cross-sectional research studies on language and aging. Components of cognition. After reaching a certain point in life, we all begin to experience the effects of aging on our bodies. Joint and muscle stiffness, a slower metabolism, and declines in endurance are all too common as we get older. But the brain undergoes changes as well, and this affects a number of cognitive systems. Let's begin by reviewing some of the cognitive processes that are affected by aging. At a general level, evidence points to a decline in how quickly our cognitive processes operate. This is referred to as a decline in processing speed. This slowing has a detrimental effect on functioning for a wide variety of cognitive tasks, such as visual matching, identifying similar objects, and visual search, comparing 2 pictures for differences, to name just 2. Memory also seems to change over time, but different types of memory change differently. For example, let's compare short-term memory and working memory, which share similarities but are in fact different. Short-term memory can be thought of as the ability to maintain items in conscious awareness, such as a telephone number, a list of words, or a set of directions. The size of short-term memory doesn't change greatly with age. However, this is not true of working memory, which involves transforming the information in some way, such as recalling a list of words in reverse order. The ability of working memory to perform such transformations shows age-related declines. Another aspect of cognitive processing is called executive function, which coordinates a range of cognitive activities such as memory, perception, attention, decision-making, and language. If cognitive processes are likened to members of an orchestra, then executive function serves as the conductor. Many aspects of executive function have been studied, and these aspects typically show declines across the adult lifespan. For example, one important role of executive function is inhibitory control. This refers to the ability to attend to one thing while ignoring another. Anyone who drives a car is familiar with deciding what requires attention and what can be ignored. Noticing children who are playing catch by the side of the road could require a sudden shift in attention, whereas a barn on the side of the road would not and could be safely ignored. An example of a laboratory task that assesses inhibitory control is the Stroop task, in which participants are asked to name the colors that words are printed in. However, the words themselves are color names, such as the word red printed in blue ink. The automatic recognition of the word red interferes with subject's ability to rapidly provide the correct response, in this case, blue. If inhibitory control is affected by age, then we would expect older adults to do worse on the Stroop task, and they do. Another role of executive function involves switching rapidly between 2 different tasks, such as writing a memo and scanning email as it arrives on a computer screen. Most people believe that they are good at dealing with such multitasking, but in fact, each attentional switch incurs further processing costs. And as you may have guessed by now, older adults experience more disruption in task switching than do those who are younger. Such cognitive declines give us legitimate cause for concern. However, one should keep in mind several caveats to prevent drawing overly pessimistic conclusions about the mental faculties of older adults. One of these is that people are highly variable in their susceptibility to the effects of cognitive aging. For example, researchers who followed a set of older adults over a 6-year period found considerable individual differences. Some participants showed significant declines, whereas others changed hardly at all. And though many people in their 60s and early 70s believe they are experiencing significant cognitive decline, research suggests that meaningful changes don't become common until after age 75. Another important issue to keep in mind is that we know less about what happens to our language abilities during middle age. To some degree, this is a consequence of how research is typically conducted. Experimenters need participants to study, and so language research is often carried out using so-called convenience samples, such as school children or college students. Researchers at the other end of the age spectrum have often drafted retired college alumni and nursing home residents into their studies. However, assuming an 80-year lifespan, about half our lives is spent between the end of our formal education and retirement. Consequently, we know much less about language during middle adulthood, age range 25 to 65. This missing middle problem makes it more difficult to tell a complete story about how language changes across the adult lifespan. One final caveat. Age-related cognitive decline can be offset in a variety of ways. These include cognitive and physical activity, social engagement, and proper nutrition. Some training regimens for older adults, such as working memory exercises, also appear to confer some benefits. So far, we have only considered outcomes linked to healthy cognitive aging. Other outcomes can have a far greater negative impact. A variety of brain diseases and neurocognitive disorders, collectively referred to as dementia, can have a devastating effect on a person's ability to think, reason, and remember. Although Alzheimer's disease is the most common form, there are many others as well, such as vascular dementia and Lewy body dementia. The cruelty of such disorders is that they strip away not only a person's cognitive abilities, but also their personality and sense of self. The decline into dementia is typically not a sudden one. Many individuals go through a transitional state during which they may be identified as having mild cognitive impairment, MCI. Doctors make this diagnosis when someone experiences mental difficulties that do not interfere with daily living. A variety of tools for assessing MCI have been developed. One commonly employed battery is the Mini Mental State Examination, MMSE, which clinicians use to assess whether someone is experiencing garden variety forgetfulness and occasional lapses in judgment, or something more serious. MCI may or may not progress to dementia. In addition, we should note that many other conditions can mimic symptoms of dementia, including depression, stroke, urinary tract infections, brain tumors, head injury, and alcohol abuse. Doctors today cannot definitively diagnose Alzheimer's disease while a person is alive. An autopsy of the brain is necessary to detect the telltale amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles that are characteristic of the disorder. However, the presence of such plaques and tangles does not mean that someone exhibited signs of the disease when she was alive. In some cases, it appears that protective factors prevent the physiological changes in the brain from manifesting themselves as a loss.
We hope you enjoyed this preview. To continue listening to this audiobook on Google Play Books, use the link in the video description.